Hello again, and welcome back to the Pastors
Hello again.
podcast. We hope you had a great Thanksgiving, and we're happy to be back reporting. I'm Natalie.
I'm Bridget.
And I'm Macy. Last time you saw us, we were talking about Jamestown and early America. Today, we're going to jump forward quite a bit to more recent history and talk about America and elsewhere.
The topic of today is 1968. And so maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but this was an absolute watershed year in so many ways. We could talk about it forever.
Well, let's not waste any time.
Yes, let's get into it. Something we're going to talk a lot about today is communism. So we're going to jump to the international scene first. I'm going to be presenting about the Prague Spring, which is just one example of what was happening in the Eastern Bloc and then Soviet response to increasing freedoms. Obviously, this is just a single glimpse into the Eastern Bloc at this time, but it's a great way to look at what's happening.
Take it away.
Thank you. So for a brief background to bring everybody up to date to 1968, Czechoslovakia was a part of the Eastern Bloc, so that's Soviet-controlled communist Eastern Europe. From 1953 to early 1968, Czechoslovakia is under the power of the first secretary, and at the time it's a guy named Novotny. He's a pretty staunch Stalinist. He's like supporting limiting personal freedoms. But the end of his power is going to come in early 1968 because of a bunch of protests break out, mainly by students calling for him to step down. Eventually, the protests work because he's lost a lot of support from the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, also known as the CPC, and from the Soviet leader Brezhnev himself. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for what's going to go on in 1968.
Yeah.
So after he steps down, a guy named Alexander Dubček is elected for secretary. He gets to work pretty fast with reforms. Important to note that Dubček himself is a communist. He doesn't like come to power with hopes of like overturning the system or anything like that. But he does believe in reforms to better the lives of citizens in Czechoslovakia. And it will be how these reforms play out that really cause a problem for Dubček later.
Okay, so earlier you referred to this event as the Prague Spring. What exactly does that mean, and why is that the name that the time becomes known as?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So referring to something as a spring in this context doesn't refer to the season. We've talked earlier in a separate podcast about the Arab Spring.
Right.
So similar name there, but it just refers to something opening up.
Okay.
So Dubček's Socialism with a Human Face, which is like the nickname for his reforms, opened up Czechoslovakian society. So like once forbidden Western media, radio, television is like able to play in the homes of the people in the country. Free speech, assembly, and press are now not only being allowed, but are encouraged by the Dubček government.
Cool. Okay, so it seems like things were changing what looked to be for the better in Czechoslovakia under Dubček's leadership. So how did the Soviets react to this, considering that Czechoslovakia was still under their control?
Yeah, so this is a really important question for understanding how the Prague Spring is going to play out. Pretty quickly, the Soviets are concerned about what's going on in the country under the action program, which is the official name for the reforms. Dubček allows for like small scale private enterprises to open up. So obviously, this is not viewed very favorably by the Soviets. They view this as like the beginnings of a return to capitalism. And they worry about like a domino effect taking hold in the Eastern Bloc countries. For a little bit of background context, Yugoslavia had split with the Soviets in 1948, so they kind of worried about something like that happening. So the Prague Spring like threatened to weaken Soviet power.
Okay.
So meetings between Soviet and Czechoslovakian representatives are going on throughout the Prague Spring, so throughout 1968. And pretty soon Dubček realizes that like he's in a very interesting position. Like he is trying to walk this tightrope between reforms for his country and what like the people want and also what Soviet leadership wants. Unfortunately for Dubček, like his attempt to walk this line doesn't end very successfully. So on the night of August 20th and into the morning of August 21st, forces of the Five, made up of USSR, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and East Germany, make their way into Czechoslovakia. This invasion was seen as pretty shocking to both Czechoslovakia itself and outside forces. As Soviet tanks made their way into Prague, tons of people come out to the street to protest this. But unfortunately for them, Czechoslovakia would soon end the spring and return to Soviet puppet rule.
That really goes to show just how quickly things can change, even in a country like Czechoslovakia and the Eastern Bloc.
Agreed. I think it's often when we think of political change in terms of like years, election cycles, decades. But what I take away from this is that once any kind of reform starts and happens, especially those regarding personal freedoms and things like that, it's kind of hard to slow or contain it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the Soviets were worried about and what, like, led to the invasion.
Mhm.
Um, how the Prague Spring played out is a great example of how 1968 was very much centered in the Cold War and,
Yeah.
how the Cold War tensions are responsible for much of what occurred during this year and more of what we're gonna talk about later. This extends beyond Czechoslovakia. Natalie, I think you're gonna talk about the Vietnam War, so take it away.
Yes, so the Vietnam War is possibly one of the most convoluted events in recent history. There's a lot of intricate politics that surround the war, but the year 1968 was critical in terms of the US's war and involvement in Vietnam.
Yeah, so you should give like quick breakdown on the war and the context of it, so we all know.
Yeah, great idea. So, after World War II ended in 1945, a new global concern arose. That concern was the spread of communism. So, for the US, the main communist enemy was the Soviet Union, or the USSR, now known as Russia. There were many proxy wars fought within the Cold War time period, one of these being Vietnam. Vietnam began fighting for their independence from the French in the mid to late 1940s. At the helm of this movement was a communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, I'm sure many are familiar with. And after the war with the French, Vietnam split into Vietnam and South Vietnam, much like what happened in Korea. So the North was communist, the South was not. The US is afraid of communists spreading, and many subscribe to the domino theory, meaning the belief that communism is going to spread and spread to nearby countries until it gets to the US and then everyone is doomed. This is not exactly a backed theory. You'll, of course, the Vietnam War ends with America's loss and America doesn't fall to communism, so mute point, I guess. But through the 1950s, the US is making its views on Vietnam clear. We cannot let Vietnam be communist. Things come to a head in 1964 when a US destroyer is allegedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese forces. In response, US President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allows the US military to respond to any armed attack by the North Vietnamese, thus leading the United States into the Vietnam War. It's critical to note here that there's really no evidence that the North Vietnamese forces attacked the US destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin, so it's entirely possible that this war started over a false report.
So that was a great rundown, Natalie, but I'm guessing obviously you had to leave a lot out.
Yes, so definitely for sure I left a lot out. There is so much more to this conflict than what I just explained, but for time's sake, this is all you get.
Yes, so the war begins in 1965 officially. What happens between then and 68 that is important for us to know?
Yeah, so let me give you another speed run. Fighting has been ongoing since the beginning of the war, and we aren't talking battles for land or ground. The Vietnam War is focused on search and destroy missions, meaning that a unit, an American military unit, would receive intelligence that there's enemy troops or machinery, go to that location, destroy what they needed to, and return to where they came from. Sometimes these search and destroy missions would just be burning down villages because there were suspected enemies living there. Sometimes there were, sometimes there weren't. Beyond that, optics are getting far worse for the US. As time dragged on, Americans were becoming less supportive of the war effort, which brings us to 1968, which is a major turning point for the war.
So did anything major happen in maybe January of 1968, Natalie?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it did. So 1968 begins with the launch of the Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese forces. The two sides, North Vietnam and the Americans and then the South Vietnamese who are working together, had agreed to a truce for the Lunar New Year, but the North took that opportunity to launch a surprise attack on American troops in the South. The footage of Tet was really astounding for Americans back home to watch because they saw the American military on the defensive in real time, making the support for the war effort further decline. Tet was a defeat for the North Vietnamese, but it was also a defeat for the US military in terms of retaining support on the home front. Tet also led to widespread anti war protests at home, and Tet was one of the contributing factors to Lyndon B. Johnson's decision to run against running for reelection. This changes a lot in terms of how the war is fought from an American standpoint. In January, another major military event took place, the Battle of Hue, which became the bloodiest battle of the war.
It seems like a lot of what happened in 1968 strongly influenced public opinion at home about the war.
Yeah, this is a really critical part of the history of the Vietnam War in general. Public opinion plays a massive role in how presidential administrations deal with the war, how anti war movements impacted the energy of the home front, and really how the war came to an end. Bridget, you researched a bit on the home front and some other things happening in America, so why don't you bring us up to speed there?
Okay, I'm gonna try and hit all the major events to the best of my ability, but certainly some things are gonna be missed, so bear with me. Okay, to start, the 1960s generally was a decade that experienced the impact of a major mass movement known as the Civil Rights Movement. Black Americans organized and fought for equal rights and better treatment, and one of the many leaders of the Civil Rights Movement was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, he was obviously a major actor in this movement, and he's well known for his advocacy of achieving civil and economic reforms through nonviolent action specifically.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the I Have a Dream speech. It's such a well-known moment from American history.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So at this point, MLK has been an active player in the civil rights movement for a while. In April, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to support the city's sanitation workers' strike. On April 4th, he was shot and killed by a sniper while standing on the balcony of the motel he was staying at. He was shot by James Earl Ray, who initially confessed and then recanted and said he was part of a larger conspiracy, but he never got to be retried before he died. So, I want to put an aside here and talk about how King has been characterized through a historical lens to much of our country, through like education system, government, just general
Mhm.
society. And I wanted to ask you guys what you think the implications of this assassination are for America at this time. What does this convey to people?
Yeah, these are great questions. The first thing that comes to mind for me is obviously this is a really tense time in American history. And when it comes to political assassinations, you have JFK, who was shot and killed in 1963. Malcolm X was then shot in 1965. So I think this is just a really like a period that's filled with a lot of turmoil. And honestly, if I were an American at this time, I'd be frankly really scared about, things that are just happening left and right that it seems like there's no control
Mhm.
over.
Mhm.
You mentioned earlier, like, how MLK was, like, perceived or, like, was used by the government. Like, we've talked about how he's often viewed as, like, a non-violent activist, which he was, but that image has also been used to almost discredit other, civil rights activists like Malcolm X, like Fred Hampton, like many Black women who were really essential to that movement. And, like, we see the, like, almost, like, the view of the Black Panther Party,
Mhm.
which, provided, like, medical care, provided, like, schooling for these communities, yet we're, like, making it seem like a very bad organization, and obviously, like, there's a lot going on, but I think it's interesting how the education system has, like, lifted up MLK as a nonviolent, activist when, like, he was very against the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
and, like, kind of cherry picking what they take from the movement, I think is a very interesting thing to look at more into the modern day.
And jumping off of that, I think one of the biggest misconceptions in historical memory is that MLK was kind of the greatest or the only leader of the civil rights movement.
Mhm,
That's absolutely not true. He had a very strong and maybe unique message within it, one of nonviolence
mhm.
mainly. But there were certainly other main actors who were heading up the movement as well, some of which you just mentioned. And I think that it's kind of on purpose that our society only remembers one of them
Mhm.
who kind of his message was perhaps the most palatable to what the message of
Yeah.
society or whatever wanted to depict. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that. But I just wanted to have a time to sort of discuss that really quick.
Mhm.
Good question.
So I'll move on. So this moment really stunned America, and it was deeply saddening. Obviously, it felt like a huge step back for all the work that the civil rights movement was doing in this decade, and you can imagine the feeling of dejection among Black
Mhm.
Americans.
And I think we can definitely feel that as gun violence is still prevalent in American society today, what was the public's reaction after this assassination?
Yeah, it's actually the next event that I wanted to cover, so thank you.
You're very
Immediately
welcome.
immediately following MLK's assassination on April 4th, America witnessed the Washington, D.C. riots from the 4th to the 11th. So when news got to D.C. about MLK, collective anger and sorrow drove crowds to go to the streets and protest what had happened. From there, it escalated when people started throwing rocks through windows and things like that. Businesses were harmed. There was some looting, but it got even more grave when protesters started lighting fires, and the police and fire departments were just overwhelmed.
Yeah, this part's really complex to me since these people are grieving such a major loss. I mean, really everyone is grieving such a major loss. MLK was a massive figure in like this time, and that loss is substantial, but there's also so much destruction happening. It's really hard to find a response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of that, LBJ, president at the time, was very careful on how he responded to the riots. So he basically, at the immediate response, police officers were instructed to not shoot rioters. They were allowed to use tear gas for crowd control purposes. Two rioters were shot anyway, but it's possible that the number could have been higher had they not received those directions.
Yeah.
And the second day, April 5th, is when DC requested federal help. In all, 13,000 National Guardsmen were sent to DC, and when deploying them, LBJ instructed them to use minimal force and to carry ammo but not load their guns. So his strategy was to exemplify a massive show of force but not need to use it, and it was overall effective. None of the deaths during the riots were caused by military units' gunfire.
Okay, so you said it was effective, and I'm pretty sure once the National Guard was deployed, things began to get resolved. So what does the aftermath of something like this look like?
Yeah, that's right. The aftermath is probably hard to understand unless you have some photos to refer to. I had found some doing my research and it was like hard to see. It was very unfamiliar, I guess. But more than 900 businesses were damaged. Some were never able to reopen. 700 dwellings were destroyed as well. And by the end of it, the 11th, 7,600 rioters, adults and juvenile, were arrested by police. There was a mixture of smoke from tear gas and all the fires that covered the city like a blanket, and underneath the streets looked like rubble, like a battlefield. And then 13 people died throughout the riots.
And are there any other outcomes of this event?
Yeah, let's circle back to that question. So, April 11th is the last day of the DC riots, but it's an important date for another reason. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed into law by LBJ on that day, and this was another step towards more fair treatment to all Americans, and it honored the legacy of MLK.
Yeah, that's a really important piece of legislation. So what's next for America in this year?
Yeah, so now I'm gonna sound like a broken record. June 5th was another sad day as political disagreement was resolved by brutality rather than cooperation. Robert F. Kennedy was an American politician, a member of the famous Kennedy dynasty. He served as the Attorney General for his brother, John F. Kennedy, the president elected in 1960. After that, RFK served as a New York senator until his death. On March 16th of 1968, he announced his candidacy for the presidential election. At this time, he was a well-loved figure and popular. He had won 5 of 6 Democratic primaries by the beginning of June, and he showed great promise as the potential Democratic nominee. But then on June 5th, he prepared to give a speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was walking through the kitchen to shake hands with staff, and then he went to a corridor and encountered reporters. And this is where he was shot and fatally wounded by Saran Bashara Saran, and 5 others were wounded as well.
He survived a little bit after the shooting, correct?
He did. There's this really memorable picture that I found from Life magazine's website that shows him laying on the ground on the moments after he's shot with his eyes open and this blank expression. It's really eerie and sad. But from there, he was rushed to an LA hospital where he died the next day. And after that, his body was moved to rest near JFK's in Arlington National Cemetery.
Did we go and see his grave? We were just
we
in
did.
DC recently at Arlington this summer.
Yeah.
Is it
like
like
he was next to him?
oh, right next to him? Interesting.
Or nearby or something. I think we passed by it.
Interesting. I didn't catch that. Robert McNamara is also buried there. I took a picture
we saw
of
that.
his grave, so
Important person for the Vietnam War.
yes, yeah.
definitely.
Okay, so we've covered the basic series of events here. So let's talk about Saran and the possible motivation.
Yes. So Saran was Palestinian born and he later moved to America with his family in the 1950s. So y'all have both taken courses on the Middle East region and its history, and the politics. So I'm sure you know more than I do. So correct me if anything is wrong. But Saran became vocal in the 1960s about his opposition to Israel, especially after the Six-Day War in 1967.
Yeah.
And in this, Israel seized control of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Old City, and the Old City of Jerusalem. And so in his campaign for president, RFK had voiced support for Israel, and this anger must have motivated Saran to assassinate him.
I actually didn't know that RFK was assassinated over his opinions about the Middle East. That's very
Yeah.
interesting.
I had no idea about that either.
Yeah, I definitely didn't really understand its full scope until I was researching for this.
Yeah.
But I did want to pull this quote. On June 14th of 1968, about 9 days after his assassination, Life magazine's issue posted the following question. How many times must we live through these throat-paralyzing sequences of days of gunplay, grief, and muffled drums?
I think that's a very interesting quote. One, we can look at how obviously gun violence is still something that very much affects the political scene today, the lives of like so many people, and to think that like they're questioning that in 1968, we're sitting here in 2025, almost 26, with I would say the same question.
Yeah, and I'm to bring it like to the kind of the main debate around gun violence, which is school shootings. We're, decades away from Columbine at this point, which is the kind of first like major school shooting that grips the nation. And so to see that like this is happening in like a different context, but we haven't even reached the extent of like
Mhm.
what school shootings will become for Americans, and we really haven't seen any like massive solution to the school shooting epidemic that like is currently plaguing America.
Yeah.
So guns have always been a very convoluted issue in America for sure.
Yeah. I thought this quote was really powerful and obviously still salient to an extent today. So I thought like it obviously evokes thoughts and opinions in
Mhm.
everyone when
You
they
could
read
have
it.
told me it
So
was from,
wanted
a
to
magazine
invite.
today, and
Yeah.
I would have
Yeah.
no questions about
So I
that.
wanted to
Yeah.
throw it at you guys and see what you thought.
Mhm.
But moving on a little bit, as for Saran, actually, he was detained at the crime scene and put on trial. On April 1st, 1969, he was convicted for first-degree murder and assault with intent to murder, and he was sentenced with the death penalty. Actually, though, his sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment, and believe it or not,
Wow.
he is still alive today in California prison.
Is he really?
Yes, to connect this to today, as of August of 2021, a parole panel found Saran suitable for parole, but California Governor Gavin Newsom rescinded that, and he is still in prison.
That's right. I had no
Yeah.
idea about that.
Yes, this isn't like super important to the 1968 topic, but I was
It's
reading up on
just
it and I was like,
interesting, yeah.
I don't know why I didn't think he was still alive.
I
Like
don't
that's what.
or even that he was possibly put up for parole, like,
Yep.
that's yeah, I don't that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
this like the Kennedy curse is like
Yeah.
definitely a real and like interesting topic to look at, especially now that like the Kennedys are somewhat back in politics, and they've
Mhm.
always, remained in politics, but I would say they're taking on a very active and prevalent role currently. I don't know, like that's really prominent, knowing that, this person that has been part of like assassinations on the Kennedys is like still alive
Yeah,
when
for, like,
there's
a new
a
generation of
new
Kennedys,
generation
yeah,
of
like,
Kennedys.
2 new generations of Kennedys,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Okay, I'll skip to August now. So, Chicago was gearing up to host the Democratic National Convention for the presidential election later that year. So this year, there is no clear frontrunner for the Democrats. So the incumbent president, LBJ, was still eligible to run for another term technically, and incumbents usually have the best chance of winning, but like we said earlier, he stepped down from the race in, I believe, March.
Yeah, so he told Americans he would not get distracted by a re-election campaign, as he needed to focus entirely on the Vietnam War.
Right. Up until June, just 2 months before the DNC, RFK had been the frontrunner, and people really liked him. But obviously, he was assassinated and removed from the race. And as a result, the Democratic Party was fragmented and lacked direction. On top of
Familiar.
yes. On top of this trouble they're facing, 10,000 protesters decided to travel to Chicago to launch a demonstration.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure they understood that this would get a lot of publicity due to their proximity to the DNC. So what happened?
Yeah, so this is where things go awry, really. On the convention's third night, thousands of these protesters staged their demonstration. They broke out of their assigned protest areas and started to march to the Conrad Hilton Hotel, the DNC's headquarters. It said that the protesters did not intend to act with violence, but they were expected to face violence.
What was the response to the protesters when they, like, broke out of this assigned area?
Yeah, so from what I gathered about the events, it happened somewhat like this. One guy climbed a flagpole in a park near the hotel and started lowering the American flag. Police grabbed him and beat him. So, in retaliation, protesters threw sticks and bricks and things like that at the police. Protest organizers tried to reestablish peace amongst the crowd, but at this point it was too late and police advanced on the crowd. Officers beat demonstrators, women, elderly, journalists, and they used tear gas in people's faces even. And this moment was called the Battle of Michigan Avenue.
Interesting.
yeah, that's
You don't hear that kind of terminology really
Yeah.
like thrown
Battle.
around, like battle between like
Yeah.
I
I
survived
don't
the
think
Battle
it's
of
like
Michigan Avenue.
yeah, I don't
you
know if it's like the official terminology, but like that's what it's like
Mhm.
colloquially known as. So
interesting.
Yeah. So what was like the aftermath of this? I'm guessing, things are going on. And like were there punishments given out, to
yeah.
the police, to the protesters, to who?
Yeah, fortunately the police didn't shoot anyone. There were no deaths. There was just a lot of violence. Um, LBJ ordered a report about these events to be completed and he hurried it along. So what's known as the Walker Report was released just 3 months later, and in it stated that most officers did not face disciplinary action. And then, contrary to that claim, Chicago released its own report before the Walker Report, blaming most of the violence on radical protest leadership, 7 of whom would be put on trial.
So this ties into my topic from earlier. It's very clear how unpopular the war was. People
Mhm.
couldn't understand why we were involved in Vietnam and why we were dragging out this dismal and daunting war. And people were obviously trying to voice their opinion on that.
Mhm.
Definitely.
The lack of repercussions is a little shocking, but maybe it shouldn't be shocking, but it's a little shocking. I know the main major consequence of this was the trial of the Chicago Seven. But that was an action against the protesters themselves.
Mhm.
Even though it's different from the assassinations we talked about earlier, violence resulting from political differences seems to be like a very defining part of 1968 in America.
Yeah, definitely. The DNC riots were really alarming because it was a moment where feelings just got out of hand and the situation escalated uncontrollably. Police are supposed to protect civilians, and even if it's their job to disperse a crowd, it does not warrant that kind of chaos. So there's videos of the riots, which we've seen in class, and I
Mhm.
recommend everyone search up and find. It provides a good visual.
Okay, so now I'm guessing you're going to tell us about the last major American event of this year.
Yes, I am. So there's been a lot to cover. I'm sorry, but we're in the home stretch now. From August, let's move forward again to November. It's time for the presidential election.
That's right. A lot of events we've talked about have related to this election in some way, and it's kind of led up to this.
Yes. So we already said this. LBJ's not running. RFK has been assassinated. So LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was chosen as the Democratic candidate.
Yeah, so he's not really a well-known name, and I know he wasn't president. So how does he fare as the Democrat in the general election?
Well, you're right. In fact, the divisions over selecting a nominee meant that he wasn't a really strong or unifying candidate. He ran on a politics of joy message.
Seems like the wrong year to. Seems like the wrong year.
It just didn't land with Americans after the two brutal assassinations and the worsening Vietnam War. And so then shifting to the Republican Party, there were 4 candidates in the primary, but Richard Nixon won the Republican nomination. If you've listened to our Watergate podcast, you've heard us go on and on about him.
Yeah, so the short version is he was vice president to Eisenhower in the 1950s, lost the presidential election to JFK in 1960, and then as president and even as a presidential candidate, he was a pretty shifty character.
It's a good way to put it. Thank you. So due to Humphrey's unpopularity and a third-party candidate who won a decent amount of electoral votes,
Yeah.
Nixon won pretty comfortably.
Yes, that's true. But there's a little bit of a more interesting part of this election that I'm hoping we talk about. Maybe having something to do with a little bit of treason.
This is about Anna Chenault, correct?
You're right. So while LBJ was committed to handling the Vietnam War, he wanted to start peace talks with South and North Vietnam to bring an end to the war. And if he were able to open up the peace talks, this could really reconcile his image with Americans. Unfortunately, at the same time, the Nixon campaign was working with Anna Chenault, a Chinese-born Republican fundraiser in America. She was in South Vietnam negotiating on Nixon's behalf with their government. Chenault promised that if they held out on LBJ's proposed peace talks, that when Nixon got elected, they would get a better deal.
So what could have possibly inspired him to do this?
The goal here
Question.
Yes. The goal here was that if LBJ couldn't secure peace talks, it would harm his image with Americans. So he obviously couldn't run again. And because he had endorsed Humphrey, by default, it harmed his campaign too.
I also just want to jump in and say if this hadn't happened, it's possible that the Vietnam War could have ended like substantially earlier than when it did.
Yeah.
So just a crazy move by
Yeah.
Mr. Nixon
Yeah.
for sure.
It's a lot of personal gain that's
Yes.
motivating him.
Yeah, for that memoir, right?
Always everything for the memoir. Well, in the end, we know Nixon wins. But it was definitely like he couldn't do this. Like this was not allowed. This was treason. He was living up to that tricky nickname.
Good cat.
Like you can't do this. This
Yeah,
isn't
so
allowed.
LBJ considered this treason for sure. He considered
I consider it treason as well.
We
Me and
agree with him,
LBJ.
I'm just saying that he considered bringing these charges against Nixon, but ultimately decided to not. And this is because he thought it would ruin the sanctity of the office of president and create a constitutional crisis. So he put country over party and knew that Nixon would probably be elected.
Yeah, I guess he was right in the end, but
So to bring this back to a bit of current day and relate it to modern day politics, there is this constant theme of presidents sort of doing these shady things almost and getting away with it. I mean, what can you do? It's not like the people do have power over the president. We just don't really use it to the fullest of our extent, really. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a consistent theme that can be shown today.
I think Nixon would have loved that new ruling that the president has immunity over
Yes.
official
Yeah.
acts. I think he would have adored it.
yeah, he would have had a great time with that one.
Field day.
He tried. He acted like he had
He's
it.
probably
Yeah.
the original architect. Of
Yes.
that.
That's probably somewhere in the Supreme Court's like footnotes, like Nixon did it.
Yeah,
it's
so
okay.
it's fine.
It's cool. Yeah.
You might be onto something. A theme obviously that we're seeing in all of 1968 is really a lot of political turmoil. I think you can kind of relate that almost to today, maybe in like a good way of being like we're not the first people to feel this way,
Absolutely.
but also in a way of like political violence is happening, gun violence is happening. It's very interesting to like, at least for me personally, I'm looking at 1968 and I'm like, oh, I'm looking in a mirror. Like this, I'm seeing a lot of today in
Yeah.
1968.
We
Yeah.
haven't had a president assassinated in current memory. We've had an attempt on a president assassination attempt. But I mean, recently was it this past summer?
I think
Yes.
June.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This past summer, Melissa Hortman, Minnesota House, who's the Speaker of the Minnesota
Yeah,
House,
Speaker of the House.
was assassinated along with her husband and their golden retriever in their house. So I mean, this is certainly happening still and is, I would say, like between the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and then this assassination of this House Speaker, those are two in recent memory that we haven't really seen a lot of until this past year and a half, really.
Yeah. Reading all this stuff about America in 1968, it just gives me this understanding of just this constant atmosphere of just uncontrolled emotion and like things getting out of hand and violence escalating constantly. And it's just like you can sort of feel that conveyed to you by reading all these events or hearing about them or whatever. And it's just it kind of relates to today. I don't know if it's the same magnitude, but I can see similarities. And I will say like something that brings a little bit of like reassurance to me is that like at least like this isn't unprecedented per se. Like at least you've seen like they got through 1968 and
Right.
like yeah, so there's a little bit of maybe hope.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Anything else to add?
Seems like a lot was going on this year.
Yes.
We would have had so many podcast episodes
Yes.
dropping in 1968. We've been on the radio, fireside chat
Yes.
with us.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this really interesting episode on this 1 year of history. Again, there's so much we're leaving out when it comes to
Oh my gosh.
1968. But thanks for listening in, and we hope to see you back here soon.